I worked out in Wyoming in the middle of nowhere at a large oil refinery back in the 80s. The plant was rather large and well lit. It was impossible to miss at night. There was one road in and one road out. The rest of the land nearby was just dirt and brush. My job alternated who had to work the graveyard shift since no one ever wanted to do it. Some people reported while on the graveyard shift they would see werewolves and other creatures just outside of the plant. When I first started working there, I actually volunteered to work the graveyard shift. Not only did I get the extra pay, but I wanted to see these werewolf-like creatures around the plant. I pulled into the plant around 7:30 with excitement. It was just a few minutes of daylight before the sun had completely set. We had to park in a gravel lot about a few hundred feet away from the plant. This was due to the large plant needing to have large oil rigs to be able to pull in and out with ease, so we had to park far away. The plant illuminated the night sky, which provided light around the plant, just shy of the parking lot. My shift ended at 6 a.m. while it was still dark, so I'd have to make the long walk from the well-lit plant into the darkness of the night. I clocked in and began earning my time and a half that the company offered since no one wanted to work the shift. The plant was mostly empty, except for a small skeleton crew that just watched over some machines to make sure nothing blew up. Time seemed to crawl by, and I didn't notice anything different from working in the day. The machines were loud, and I was not able to hear anything other than the machines from inside the plant. During my first smoke break, I went outside to the designated smoke area near the parking lot and lit my cigarette. The noises from the plant were still pretty audible, but not nearly as loud. As I was smoking, I noticed what looked like a set of green eyes out in the darkness of the night. Jeez, is this what all the hype is about? The eyes looked like they belonged to your average deer or maybe a coyote. These things were a dime a dozen out in Wyoming. "Thanks for the easy money," I yelled out to the supposed werewolf deer. How were these guys so afraid of nature, I thought. Talk about a big group of sissies. My break was almost up, and I was just finishing my last cigarette when I finally heard,
"Thanks for the easy money,"
coming from the green, glowing eyes in the darkness. My ears perked up, and I looked out at the eyes. They were now much closer, but still not within the lights of the plant. I seriously considered going out there to see this a-hole coworker who was giving me a hard time, but my break was now up. I also began to have this weird feeling of being watched, as if multiple people were watching me. I finished my cigarette and hurried inside. Once inside, the feeling stopped and I felt foolish. I told one of the night managers that his attempt to scare me did not work. He seemed confused and asked me what had happened. I told him that someone was trying to scare me while I was out on my smoke break. He looked up from his paperwork and repeated what I had said. "Someone spoke to you from out in the darkness?" he asked earnestly. "I know you're just trying to give me a hard time. It won't work," I said defiantly to the manager. The manager grabbed a walkie and called over security to where I was smoking. "You didn't speak to it, right?" he asked concerningly. I lied since I began to feel more nervous about the situation and said no. He then seemed to lighten up a little bit and warned me to never speak out to it or even acknowledge it. They cannot come inside the light unless you speak to it. That's what the lights are for. But don't tell anyone, I told you. I began to feel a sinking feeling in my stomach. I knew I messed up, but I didn't want to expose my lie to the manager. I went back to working, hoping that yelling at whatever it was out there wouldn't be a big deal. While working inside, I heard a loud alarm go off. I assumed it had something to do with one of the machines not working properly. We were all told to go inside the break room, and we would be instructed from there. While inside, we were told that we were to have a buddy system and that no one was allowed outside. I wasn't afraid, but I was concerned about what was going on. I asked the manager on duty what was going on, and he told me that now was not the time or the place. After 20 minutes, we were finally allowed out of the break room, but something felt different. The air had a weird static vibe to it. I instinctively felt on edge, as if I were to be attacked at any moment and I needed to defend myself. The rest of the evening continued as normal, except we were not allowed to go outside for a smoke break. This annoyed me, but I was also pretty spooked from earlier with whatever it was outside. My shift eventually finished around 6 a.m. and the sun was about to rise. I made sure to wait until 6:30 when the sun was actually out before I made my way out to my truck. That was my last time doing the graveyard shift at that plant again. During the rest of my time there, one person got bad burns from one of the machines, but oddly enough, 2 people have gone missing during the night shift. Some people think that they arrived to work drunk and got lost once on break, but others think that something more sinister happened to them.
I used to play a lot of Xbox Live with my friends from work. I worked at a typical 9-to-5 job that paid well, but honestly, the job was boring, and playing Xbox gave us something to talk about when things got slow at work. This was back when the Xbox One had just come out, and my work friends and I loved it so much. My friends were a random group of guys, but they were fun to mess with, easy to spook. I had recently come across creepypasta stories online, and I loved to read them. My friend Jerry, though, hated anything scary, and I loved getting him worked up about anything on Xbox Live. Scary stuff just got in his head and made him all jumpy, and it was hilarious to watch. A part of me enjoyed looking up new scary stories to tell Jerry late at night when we played. I came across a new set of stories about these things called Skinwalkers. They were apparently these shape-shifting creatures that had the ability to mimic the voices of past victims to lure people to their deaths. Saying, or even thinking the word Skinwalker would have the effect of drawing them to that person like a magnet. This was perfect. When I told Jerry about this, he wouldn't be able to sleep for a week. I read up on stories and prepared my arsenal for Jerry. I was kind of a jerk then, I know. I told Jerry about the Skinwalkers, and naturally, he freaked out and actually had to log out of his Xbox early. Me and the other guys were dying with laughter just thinking about poor Jerry trying to sleep that night, checking his window every 5 minutes for these Skinwalkers. We played for another 2 hours, and I finally logged off and got ready for bed myself. As I was getting ready for bed, though, I heard a sound outside by my car. My driveway was next to my room. This got very annoying when people would pull in to do a U-turn on my street, because the lights of the cars would shine into my room and wake me up. I figured it was another random person doing a U-turn. I waited to see headlights, but they never came. I felt pretty spooked, especially after all that scary stuff I told Jerry. I went and sheepishly looked out my window. I didn't see anything, but I chose not to turn on my porch light. I didn't want to risk seeing something I didn't want to see. I tried to go to bed, but I kept hearing noises outside. I felt stupid because I knew I was only freaking myself out because of what I'd read on the internet. All those stupid, scary stories had freaked me out. I chuckled to myself knowing that Jerry was probably crapping himself enough bricks to build a castle. I then thought about what I'd been saying to Jerry. Just thinking or talking about Skinwalkers would be enough to draw them to you. And I began to wonder, could this be true? I then heard another sound outside. This time it made me jump out of my skin. This sounded like something was just outside the window. I could not ignore this sound. I crept as quietly as I could to the front of my house and turned on the porch light. I peered out my front window and looked to where I thought I heard the noise. My blood chilled as I saw 4 or 5 coyotes trying to look inside my bedroom window. Some were leaning against the window with their front paws, while the others were on all fours. Where I'm from, coyotes are pretty common, but you never see them outside of town. Some of the coyotes looked rather normal, but the others looked like roadkill, with fur and flesh hanging off of them, looking too ragged to be naturally alive. Instead of going out with my shotgun and shooting at the things, I did the only thing I had the courage to do. I pressed my truck's alarm button on my key fob. A loud siren went off while my truck's lights began to flash, better illuminating the creatures by my window. Thankfully, this actually worked, and the coyotes ran off. For a split second, however, with all the chaos of the truck alarm and all the coyotes running around, I could have sworn that for a split second, I could see one of the coyotes running like a person on its hind legs, off into the night. Seeing not one, but 5 of them, trying to peer into my window, taught me a valuable lesson about what happens when you talk about skinwalkers too much. Ever since then, I never spoke of skinwalkers out loud to anyone.
A couple of years ago, I was in the Boy Scouts. We would go camping over the summer up in the mountains called Camp Thunder Campgrounds. This was my 2nd year there, and had tons of fun the year before. Part of the fun for me and my friends were the pranks with other scout tribes. The year before, we got pranked pretty well. Someone put a dead possum in my sleeping bag. Needless to say, I was ready to get my revenge. This year I brought a gorilla mask along with some shaving cream. The gorilla mask was to conceal my identity, but if I could get a scare out of someone, then that would also be a bonus. The scout camp was up in the mountains, and naturally, we had to keep our eyes open for bears. There had been a scare a few years back when a bear found its way inside of a campsite when some scouts left out some Slim Jims, but nothing too life-threatening. We heard the story every year to help prevent unsafe camping techniques, and also to add an additional precaution to not go out past curfew. Curfew was a big deal. If you were caught out past curfew, you and your tribe could be asked to leave, so stealth was a big factor I intended on keeping. I wanted to wait until the last night to do any pranks, so if I did get caught, then I would only be sent home on the last day. The week was fun, and every day we were warned about not going out at night. The leaders of the camp had a camp bell that they would ring every morning at the meeting station. They also said that we could ring it if anyone saw a bear to warn the other campers. During the week, we had a visit from the park rangers. They told us that the town nearby has had bears coming into their yards and trying to get into their trash. The camp leaders told us that if anyone wanted to leave, due to safety of the bears, that the camp would offer us a free refund for anyone that left. Needless to say, no one left. The second to last morning, I woke up to a dozen frogs in my cabin. Someone had pranked me. Tonight, I was definitely going to get my revenge, and then some. The whole day went on slower than normal, but night finally came. I got ready and set out late, wearing my gorilla mask and putting the shaving cream in my backpack. I wanted to make sure I got whoever was getting me and my tribe, so I decided to hit all the tribes. I made my way to the first camp. They were all fast asleep. I entered the campgrounds and put shaving cream all over their cabins. For good measure, I made sure to bang on the windows and to let them see my mask to scare them. I banged on the windows, and sure enough, the scouts were pissing themselves. I tried to contain my laughter as I took off to the other camps. As I was in between camps, I got a weird feeling, like I was being watched. I was out in the woods all by myself, in a bear-infested woods, but I tried not to think about it. By this time, word had gotten around that someone was pranking the campsites, so the adults were out looking with flashlights. I decided that one prank was enough, and I started heading back to my camp, across the campgrounds. As I was walking, I heard a faint ring of a bell. The bear bell. Oh great. Either someone thought I was the bear, or there was an actual bear lurking around the campgrounds. I began to pick up the pace when I heard something behind me, snapping twigs and breathing. I did have a flashlight, but something told me not to look behind me. I began to hear a low growl, and surprisingly, words. Something was calling my name. What kind of animal could growl and also speak like a person? Normally with bears, you're supposed to walk away slowly, but for whatever reason, I disregarded this advice and I took off for my campsite. As I was running, I heard screaming from behind me and thrashing around. I felt something grab my bag, and I left it behind. Whatever it was seemed content with the bag, and it stopped following me, but I continued running. I made it back to the campgrounds, and no one saw me come in. Someone did stop by our campgrounds a couple of minutes later and told us to do a head count. They told us that 2 scouts were missing from the campgrounds, and they told us to stay inside the cabin. The next day we found out that the 2 campers that went missing were eaten by something. Everyone said they were bears, but me personally, I think it was something else. I can't but help think how lucky I was to not be among those that were grabbed. What was it that took those campers in the middle of the night? Was it the same creature that was behind me? How did it know how to speak, and how did it know my name? We owned property up in northern Idaho, where my family would naturally farm potatoes. Yes, I know, cliché. We owned a couple hundred acres with little to no people nearby. Growing up, I've only seen 3 people drive by our farm. One was our neighbor looking for his lost horse. The other 2 were college kids that had gotten lost on their way to Canada. With our large farm being so large, we had random sets of barns to house fuel and other machinery around the farm. In all, we had about 5 barns or so around the farm, and we were always told to keep the barns closed. I somewhat laughed at this idea. Nothing was out here but random deer and coyotes. I remember one summer, my sister left the barn door open and we had issues with raccoons for the rest of the year. I was the second oldest, and I was responsible for harvesting crops and storing them in the barn, while my father would go to the barns and collect the harvest for the year. Like I said, I was the second oldest. My older brother Trevor died when he was young in a tragic accident with one of the tractors. I was only 10 at the time. He was 17. I remember my father coming in late one night, covered in blood, crying with my mother. Apparently, my brother left the tractor in neutral and the tractor rolled on top of him, crushing him. My father went out to look for him when he didn't show for dinner. My father was never the same after that night, and neither was my family. Instead of being able to drive at 14 like my older brother, I had to wait till I was 18 until I was able to drive one of the tractors. This was only because my father was running low on help, and I had to talk him into it for 4 years. When I would harvest, I would like to either go in the mornings or late at night when the air was cool, since our tractors were old and did not have AC. My father would stay up late until I would come in from the late nights of harvesting crops. He would never go to bed until I would come in. During those nights of harvesting, I would see some interesting sights, some of which were haunting. I remember once I accidentally ran over a small deer that was laying in the tall crops. This was quite gruesome and caught me off guard. Blood went everywhere and I had to clean the tractor for 30 minutes. I remember one night I saw the remains of what looked like a calf that was eaten by wolves on my way back from walking inside from the harvest. Normally something like this doesn't faze me, but coming in at 2 in the morning after a harvest, it was a bit spooky. The barn nearest the house was a brisk 15-minute walk, which I normally walked without a flashlight, only having the moon to guide me. But none of that compares to what I saw one evening. Something happened one night, something I never did tell my dad, but I think I saw something imitate my dead brother. Not like another person, but a creature. Something intelligent, but evil. So here is what happened. Like I said before, we were told to always keep the barn doors closed on the property. Well, I began to get lazy the later my harvest got and the closer the barn was to the house, the more likely I figured that no one or no thing was too deadly that would try to stay in the barn that we couldn't remove on our own. It wasn't that big of a deal, but keeping the barn door open would save me from having to hop out of the tractor and opening the somewhat heavy barn door again. It would literally save me less than 1 minute of time, but coming in late after spending hours of harvesting late at night would make a big difference in my teenage mind. The day started like any other, and school dragged on like it normally did. I was driving home from school, not really paying attention to the road, when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. As I slowed down, I noticed a large, hairy animal dart quickly across the road. It looked like a wolf, but it was standing up on 2 legs. It ran as if it was wounded, but it moved so fast, impossibly fast. As quickly as the creature entered my view, it left, only leaving a small trail of dust in its path. The direction the creature was running, it would reach my family's farm in the next 3 miles, but the likelihood the thing continued straight was really unlikely. The rest of the drive home, I was freaked out, mainly because I almost crashed my car, but I've never seen anything that big, that fast, in this area. I remember one summer I went and visited my uncle in Alaska, and we went and hunted moose. Kinda reminded me of that, but the speed was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I arrived home, and the creature seemed to have escaped my mind when I saw my mother had cooked my favorite pie. After some homework, 2 slices of pie, a tall glass of milk, and some Jets vs. Patriots on ESPN, I was ready to get my chores done on the farm. I got old Betsy, aka the green tractor, fired up and began my route to harvest the potatoes, leaving the barn door open. The tractor was equipped with these old headlights that I would use to see about 30 feet ahead of me or so. For the most part, they were terrible, but considering there was nothing here for me to hit in these fields, I was in good hands. I was halfway through my route when I began to smell this terrible smell. It smelled much like that deer I hit with the tractor, but much worse. It had a weird metallic smell, like a burnt metal. For a moment, I thought old Betsy needed a new belt, but we replaced it last year. The belts usually last for 5 years easy. I made sure to keep my eyes open as I continued driving in the endless fields that laid ahead of me. I was hoping that I wouldn't have a breakdown in the middle of the field. If that were to happen, it would take me an hour or so to get back. Thankfully, the tractor didn't break down, and I continued my route. I was working my way back when the tractor lights briefly scanned across the open field, and I saw something large moving quickly, just barely out of the view of the lights. It was headed to the barn that I foolishly left open. My mind raced back to earlier in that day when I saw the creature. The creature looked like it ended up on my farm. Luckily, I was in Betsy, which was near impossible to enter while I was driving. Unfortunately, I did have to park it inside the barn I left open, and I would have to make the 15-minute walk back to the house with nothing to protect me. I hesitantly drove back to the barn after a few hours of collecting potatoes. The smell of the burnt metal was incredibly strong, and I began to feel this intense evil feeling in the air. I opened the barn door, which I left ajar, and quickly entered the tractor to pull it in. The lights on the tractor illuminated the barn. Our barns were a mess and had old tools and parts laying around. It wouldn't be that difficult to hide if you really wanted to. I made sure to double check the barn, although inside the tractor to make sure nothing got in while I was away. After waiting for 5 minutes or so, I turned off the key to the tractor, which in turn turned off my light source from inside the barn. Thankfully, the moon was out and it was able to cast some light inside the old barn. I exited the tractor and made sure to refuel the tractor before I left. As I was returning the empty fuel can, I heard my name, although it was completely distorted. It sounded like someone was speaking with damaged lungs and a really raspy voice, like they'd been smoking for 50 or so years. My first thought was that a hobo had entered the barn or something, but then I remembered the voice was calling my name. How did it know my name? I then thought that my father was out in the barn, trying to scare me. It wouldn't be the first time my father gave me a good scare, but it was very late, and for someone to pull this prank like this, you'd have to be pretty dedicated. I was able to catch a small glimpse of something that looked tall and hairy in the corner of the barn. I immediately turned tail and ran towards my home. This was a ridiculous endeavor. I was in no shape to be outrunning anything, let alone what I saw earlier that was running at those speeds. I heard what sounded like a large animal thrashing around the barn, and then hot on my trail. I was halfway back to my house when I heard something that sounded like my dead brother, calling me by my nickname that no one ever called me but him. I stupidly turned around to see the outline of my brother, but he looked like he had been hit by a car. His neck and limbs were all bent and pieces of flesh were hanging off of him. It was hard to tell what exactly I was looking at, since I felt like I was going to die from all the running and the thought of a large creature trying to kill me. I knew whatever it was trying to pretend to be my brother must have had something to do with his death. How did it know what he looked like? How did he know my nickname only my brother called me? I continued running and made it back to the house. The entire time, I could hear breathing behind me. I made the 15-minute walk into a 5-minute run. Because of this, I no longer harvest late at night, and I now have questions about the creature and about how it knew so much about my brother. Regardless, I felt lucky that I was alive, and I no longer leave the barn door open.